Hello, I am Mikey Pendergast, the whiskey ambassador for Specialty Brands, and JP has asked me to make a video to talk to you guys today about Nikka whiskey. In particular, Taketsuru, the godfather of Japanese whiskey. This little happy Japanese man right there. If at any point you want me to, or actually if I haven't expanded enough about any of these points, you want anything clarified or further information or anything, please feel free to drop myself or JP an email. I do apologize for the sound quality. I have a bit of a cold today, and I'm Canadian, so I'm quiet and also sick, so I apologize. But yeah, let's kick it off. So, Nikka. Why do we have this? What's the point in talking about him? To set the stage, I think it's fair to talk about Japan historically first, because Japan for a very long time kept closed borders. They developed local, or should I say indigenous alcohol tradition. They have things like sake and shochu and amamori, so they got distillation potentially through Korea or Thailand. So they had spirits, they had fermentations. One of the things they didn't do though is malt grains. They tend to use koji to actually turn the starch in grains into sugar for them rather than malting. And they didn't actually age stuff in barrels the way the West did. So Japan didn't really have the capacity to make anything like whiskey, and it wasn't until the Americans came, surprise, surprise, with guns and opened their borders that they got a taste of it. So a guy by the name of Commodore Matthew Perry opened Japan's borders. He brought with him quite a lot of, I would say, an obscene amount of bourbon. It wasn't a huge hit straight away, but it did gain traction, and domestically people wanted to be able to make whiskey. A kind of cowboy industry popped up where they would take local spirits and add cocoa sugar or spices and adulterate the flavors and colors, but obviously it wasn't successful enough. So this gentleman, the gentleman I showed you, he was working in a distillery, and they said, why don't we send you over to Scotland? You can see how the world leaders are making whiskey, and then bring all that knowledge back to Japan. So of course he said yes. A couple things that are worth mentioning. It was 1918, so the First World War was happening. So he was going from a country at peace to a country at war to learn how to make what is arguably a luxury good. It was also a 9.5-month journey. So this is not a flight. This was several boats and a couple of trains. I think it was a boat from Yokohama to Hawaii, Hawaii by boat to California, California over to Chicago by rail, Chicago to New York by rail, New York to London by boat, London up into Glasgow by rail. So it was not a decision you make lightly, shall we say. Kanpai, by the way. But Taketsuru gets to Scotland. He enrolls in Glasgow University. He studies organic chemistry. He falls in love with a Scottish woman, who is one of the reasons why we have Nikka today. And he also has internships in 3 different distilleries that end up forming not just the backbone for Nikka, but is sort of copied and extrapolated out to most of Japanese whiskey. It becomes the backbone of a lot of Japanese whiskey production today. So the first thing to mention is the place that he worked called Bo'ness, B-O'-N-E-S-S. That is where he ran into coffee stills. I'll talk a little bit more about them when I do the SKU videos for Nikka coffee malt and Nikka coffee grain. But column stills were made for quantity to pump out large amounts of grain whiskey to make the backbone for blends. This is where Taketsuru learned to do that. He also worked in a place called Longmorn, and Longmorn became the backbone to this place, Miyagi-Kyo. Longmorn was known for making a very Speyside style, so a lot more aromatically complex, a lot softer, a lot more sort of like white tea tannins and florality to it. Longmorn used to make the backbone to the Chivas blends, and Longmorn is where he sort of fell in love with that style of whiskey production. And then the last place he worked in was a place called Hazelburn, which still exists today, as does Longmorn. And Hazelburn makes Springbank, Hazelburn, and Longrow. He basically cut and pasted all the stuff from Hazelburn to make Yoichi. Yoichi is from northern Japan up in Hokkaido. This is where you get the nice, rich, chewy, smoky, peaty notes. So if this guy's all floral and complex, this is soft palate, this is hard palate, basically. But Taketsuru learns all these techniques. He goes back to Japan. The company that sent him over actually found out how expensive it was to make malt beverages, and they said, no, thank you. We're not into it. So they're multi-billion-dollar loss. But Taketsuru falls into the company of a guy named Shinjiro Tori. You may recognize the name from Suntory, the now multinational business conglomerate. They got their start together by opening up Japan's first ever commercial whiskey distillery. Now, Taketsuru wanted to open up the first whiskey distillery in Japan up in Yoichi. Yoichi shares the same climate as Scotland. It's in the northern island of Hokkaido in Japan. Taketsuru was very much in the mind of making Scotch, but in Japan. Shinjiro Tori wanted to make stuff efficiently and more cost effectively and be able to ship it to places. So he suggested the site of Yamazaki, and if that name rings a bell, it's because Yamazaki is a very famous whiskey. It's also the site of Japan's first ever commercial whiskey distillery. This is one of the reasons Taketsuru is considered the godfather of Japanese whiskey. He hand drew the blueprints for Yamazaki. He worked there and ran it for 10 years. He and Shinjiro Tori released a thing called Shiro Fuda, meaning white label. It was their first blended release. By all accounts, it was probably a lot more like this. It was a relatively heavily peated blend, unlike the bourbon the Japanese public had come to know and enjoy, and it was a complete commercial disaster. So it didn't sell. As a result, Taketsuru and Shinjiro Tori fell out, and they actually parted ways, never to speak again. But thanks to Rita, Taketsuru didn't just... In Japan, after losing that job, he would have just stayed running the brew house for the rest of his life. But Rita was like, you have all the knowledge, why don't you just try again? Why don't you just see if you can get some money, go open up a new distillery. So thanks to her clients who were learning piano and Japanese from her, piano and English from her in Japan, they got the money to form Dai Nippon Kabushiki Gyasa. So Nippon meaning Japan and Kabushiki kind of meaning company. The portmanteau of those two words gives you Nikka. So that's where the name comes from. So it's kind of like the great Japanese juice company's whiskey in a weird way. But they made apple brandy first to sort of tide them over. That was successful enough that they started to make malt. After that, they opened Miyagi here not too long after. So this guy was opened in 1934. This had opened in 1969. And the coffee stills are actually in this distillery. So really, it was thanks in large part to his dedication to making the type of whiskey he fell in love with in Scotland that sort of separated him from the major business conglomerate in Japan that now makes much lighter styles of whiskey. And it was thanks and almost entirely to his wife that he didn't just give up after the first hurdle and continued on to bring us Nikka as we have it today. So it's worth saying, I will do specific videos for each SKU, but whenever you taste a Nikka blend, if it's giving you texture or smoke, it's probably this guy. And if it's giving you florality, top notes, or aromatic complexity, it's probably that guy. So we have a lot to thank this guy for. One thing I will say is, in the market of Japanese whiskey, I would say Nikka is one of few who don't make the most Japanesey style whiskey. I would say Suntory's whiskey is a Japanese whiskey. Nikka whiskey is more like Scotch made in Japan by Japanese people. In fact, I would say this is the best gateway for if you have a friend who only drinks Scotch, give them this. Don't tell them where it's from and see what they say. There's a little bit of sherry that goes into the finishing on this, so it's got kind of a nice sweet finish. It is very aromatic and complex. I've had several people tell me they thought this was Speyside before telling them what it was. And if you ever have somebody who thinks they don't like smoke, this is probably the best gateway into enjoying smoke. I'm not going to say it's the best smoky whiskey in the world, but it is the best integration of smoke, I would say. I would say in the world, actually, to be fair. So the last thing to say is, a lot of the stuff in Japan tends to skew towards being a lot lighter. So Shinjiro Tori learned through a tax loophole that you could open up a izakaya, or essentially a pub, and you could sell whiskey watered down to the same strength as beer and end up clearing more money in tax. So we opened up a bunch of things called Tori's bars, with carbonation and commercial ice being relatively new. So instead of serving people beer, they would walk in and he would give them a whiskey highball. As a result of the success of that business, a lot of whiskey started to skew their flavor profiles to suit more dilution and suit things like highballs. At no point in Taketsuru's journey did he ever say, cool, let's make lighter stuff. He very famously was stubbornly just trying to make things that he liked to drink and didn't care so much about what other people thought. So although it is Japanese, I would say if you ever needed to get somebody into the realm of Japanese whiskey who is more used to things like Scotch or Irish, you might have more luck with Nikka. That was a very quick summary, though. I hope you enjoyed this video. There'll be a bunch more because there's a lot of different bottles. But yeah,